Hello comrades, this is General Luigi, and welcome to Let's Prepare to Play Fire Emblem Awakening. First of all, I'd like to say I'm both pleased and displeased with last week's election. On the one hand, my preferred pairings won. On the other hand, only one person voted. I suppose it comes with being as obscure as I am. Then again, one of my friends on court records told me he would have voted, but in his words, YouTube has got real funny about comments of late. A funniness he's not willing to indulge. Google strikes again, I complained about him enough last time though, so let's get on with the real reason this video exists. Now, again, before I start, I want to remind you that I am classifying pairings according to my personal views on what works, what doesn't, what's believable, and what isn't. You are free to disagree with me, and I wouldn't be surprised if you did, but as I pointed out in the prologue, I will not stand for flaming. Anyway, now let's really get on with the real reason this video exists. This week, our first group bride-to-be is Maribel. Frederick's non-combatant roles are brought to the forefront in his supports with Maribel. He does everything from deliver fresh clothes to Lissa's tent to plan the dinner menu. This leads to the false rumor that he is a steward. Maribel asks him about it, and while he is not officially a steward, he nevertheless engages in all of a steward's typical duties. When her request for Frederick to train her house's servants is rejected, she instead asks him to train her to be a steward so she could then train the servants herself. As a result, we get treated to both the beginning and end of her training. At first, she screws up constantly and gets visibly angry over Frederick's nitpickiness. However, by A level, she's become an extremely competent stewardess. At S level, as is the standard, they acknowledge their feelings for each other. I saw a slight bond forming between them in the A level conversation, so I can at least believe that they have become friends in the time at that conversation and S level, but it's still something I have to infer rather than see. Class 1. Maribel's supports with the Vake start out with her bothered about how people perceive her. Specifically, she realizes she's seen as a snob and wants to correct that. At first, she just relapses into being what she wishes she was not, criticizing the people she looked down upon for behaving as they did. However, Teach tricks her into making a bet with him. When she loses, she has to go with him to a common ale house, as the Vake puts it. He hoped to get her to see how commoners resented the way she looked down on them, but the people there absolutely adored her, and she them. It's tempting to criticize the idea of a single experience having such a dramatic effect on Maribel, but looking back to the C-level conversation, it turns out she had already been trying to change. The alehouse experience was just the culmination of that change. We also get to see Maribel and the Vake actually grow close to each other in the process. As critical as I am of the whole opposites attract business, these conversations actually do a great job of showing just how much Maribel and the Vake have in common, despite appearing different on the surface. Their feelings for each other strike me as fully believable, and as such, I have decided to make this a Class 3 pairing. Maribel's supports with Stahl tell us a bit about Maribel's plans for the future, as well as give us a better sense of just what kind of guy Stahl is. Maribel hopes to become a magistrate, a judge in other words, and her studies almost overwhelm her. Stahl finds her asleep standing up because she had been studying so excessively, and it even gives her stomach problems. He offers her a tonic for her stomach and advises her to get some rest. She accepts the tonic, but continues her studies without resting. When Stahl expresses concern over her health again, she explains her goals to him and Stahl offers to help her. In return, Maribel offers to help him achieve some dream of his. The only problem is that Stahl isn't exactly a big dreamer. He just likes to help people and can't really get into doing something just for his own sake. It takes a little explaining, but Maribel comes to accept that Stahl is perfectly content with helping others and isn't just being that way out of laziness. By S level, Stahl has fallen in love with Maribel, and she drops a bit of a hint that she feels the same way. They're already close at the beginning, and I can easily see them falling in love. The only thing that's bothering me is that the S level conversation almost makes Stahl out to be more of a servant to Maribel than a husband. I know that's just the kind of person Stahl is, and it's quite clear that he loves Maribel at this point, but I'm left wondering if Maribel actually agreed out of love, even though she does drop a hint that she did. Class 2. Maribel's supports with Kellum tell us a bit about him and that armor of his. It's not always easy to tell, but his armor isn't exactly a perfect fit. Kellum's too small. However, Kellum actually feels comfortable in it and practically wears it all the time. Allegedly, he even wore it to a wedding on one occasion. Maribel is bothered by this and tries to get him to wear something a bit more practical for off the battlefield, though she fails to convince him. Turns out Kellum's armor has significant sentimental value to him. His entire village pitched in to have it made for him. To him, it's a reminder of how proud everyone back home is of him. We then get a brief diversion in the A-level conversation, but it comes off as Maribel inadvertently talking down to Kellum. And then Kellum falls in love with Maribel. Note the wording there. I saw no hints in the S-level conversation of Maribel feeling the same way. She accepts, so I suppose that's something, but given what she says in the moments leading up to Kellum's proposal, it feels more as though she's just hiring him as a servant than agreeing to be his wife. Then there's the fact that we don't really see any signs of Kellum growing fond of Maribel before his proposal. Essentially, the whole thing comes off as forced. Class 0. As is standard fare for any of Lon'qu's supports with women in the first group, his supports with Maribel require him to overcome his aversion to women. It takes a moment of chasing after him, but Maribel manages to convince him to attempt to overcome this problem of his by raising the very valid point that he is being a hypocrite. He always talks about trying to grow stronger, yet he is weakened substantially by the presence of women. Regrettably, most of the transition is implied to be between the B-level and A-level conversations, but by A-level they have grown close enough, though not physically, to consider each other friends. By S-level, Lon'qu has finally managed to at least manage to get within touching distance of Maribel, and it's at this point that Maribel suggests she and Lon'qu get married. They have by this point fallen in love, and after some hesitation, albeit only because he wants to overcome his fear of women first, Lon'qu agrees to marry Maribel. Their feelings for each other strike me as honest, and I can buy the transition from friendship to love, but there's a part of me that feels as though I was being told rather than shown that they had become friends. As such, while this pairing has many of the makings of a Class 3 pairing, it fails to make the final cut. Class 2. Maribel's supports with Rickon give us a chance to see him mature somewhat. As I pointed out last time, Rickon is a noble, so of course Maribel respects him as an equal. She sympathizes with his family's financial difficulties, but insists that he is a noble because of his quality of character, not his family's holdings. The topic is dropped after sea level, however. Instead, we get a better look at Rickon's immaturity. He's in a big hurry to grow up, going so far as to try to conceal a wound he had suffered. Maribel, worried, suggests he not fight at all, considering how young he is, which, of course, offends him. He insists that as long as he can fight, he should, and that he can't stand by and do nothing while his country is in danger. Maribel retracts her earlier proposal, but tells Rickon to stop hiding wounds. The A-level conversation is essentially a continuation of B-level, with Rickon acknowledging that he was wrong to hide a wound, and Maribel acknowledging that she was wrong to treat him as a child. They come off as being friends from the start, so their feelings for each other don't come as a surprise in S-level. The conversation's cute, and while Rickon admits in said conversation that he's been in love with her since the moment they met, I'm actually not bothered by that claim. For once, it's not being used as an explanation or an excuse for earlier behavior. Class 3. As it turns out, Maribel and Gaius have a past connection that resulted in Maribel holding a grudge. Gaius had stolen from the royal treasury in the past, and when he was caught, he falsely claimed to have done it on the order of Maribel's father, who was almost executed as a result. As it turns out, though, Maribel did not know the whole story. Gaius's employers had threatened to kill Maribel if he didn't name her father as the culprit. He regretted what he did, and he later sent an anonymous letter to the magistrates with proof that Maribel's father was innocent. That letter was what ultimately saved Maribel's father from being executed. After learning all this, Maribel forgives Gaius, even going so far as to say he is, in her words, more honest than half the so-called nobles she knows. By S-level, they've fallen in love. While a bond of sorts has formed between them by the end of the A-level conversation, it strikes me as a bit weaker than I prefer. The S-level conversation could have alleviated my concerns, but it jumps right into how they feel about each other and doesn't really establish that the bond has strengthened any. The pairing comes close to being Class 3, but as with Maribel and Lon'qu, it fails to make the final cut. Class 2. In her supports with Gregor, Maribel's sense of justice is brought up. Gregor isn't exactly the most disciplined soldier, and he readily breaks many of the army's rules. Maribel gives him an earful for stealing a loaf of bread from the army's food stores. Before you ask, no, he didn't do it to feed his sister's starving family. He apologizes and makes an empty promise to stop breaking the rules. In a later conversation, Maribel excuses his charging ahead recklessly in a battle once he explains that he was doing so to protect her, but she still insists on following the rules. Then we learn that he has supposedly been getting better about that, though he also offhandedly mentions stealing pies and selling a lock of Crom's hair to a gossip leaflet. He claims that his improvement is because of Maribel's constant scolding of him. So, he admits to breaking the rules again, and then says he's been improving. I'm not buying it. And, of course, in the S-level conversation, Gregor asks Maribel to marry him, and she accepts. So, let's recap. No bond developing between them, no character development from either of them, and Maribel seems more interested in teaching her new husband how to obey the rules than anything else. I think my opinion of this pairing goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Class 0. Maribel's supports with Libra give us what I consider to be a better look at her true nature than any other supports in the game. I already mentioned Maribel plans on becoming a magistrate. However, that plan of hers includes a desire to see all be equal under the law. Were she to succeed, a noble who commits a crime would be subject to the same punishment as a commoner who commits the same crime. Her view is that subjecting a commoner to a harsher punishment is not justice. Libra is, naturally, touched by Maribel's views and says as much. Come S-level, Libra asks Maribel for her hand in marriage. While it's nice to see how much they have in common, they strike me more as allies who support a common cause than friends. Libra appears to have real feelings for Maribel, but I don't see signs that Maribel feels the same way. Libra's proposal is touching, but I got a bit of a Lenin Krupskaya vibe from it, which leaves me questioning the legitimacy of their alleged feelings for each other. Class 1. Memento Mori. That pretty much sums up the central theme of Henry's supports with Maribel. Maribel is bothered by the idea of dying, while Henry isn't the slightest bit scared of death. Henry makes no effort to reassure her or make her less scared of death, though he does mention designing a curse that kills a person instantly and painlessly. Henry has accepted that everyone dies eventually. As such, he doesn't fear his own death, though he does still make an effort to avoid dying. Maribel is at first weirded out by this, but that ultimately changes to worry as she realizes she's in love with him. Needless to say, I don't see it. As with Gregor, I saw no character development of any sort, not to mention their feelings for each other come right the frick-frack out of nowhere. Do I really need to say it? Class 0. Maribel's supports with Donal appear to have the classic don't judge a book by its cover moral to them. When Maribel gives Donal a book to memorize, he does so perfectly, something that leaves Maribel quite impressed. She had not expected a lowly farm boy to be such a diligent learner. This, in turn, leads Maribel to take it upon herself to turn Donal into a proper gentleman. The A-level conversation starts off with Maribel in the middle of teaching Donal ballroom dancing. Well, trying to teach, anyway. Turns out the experience makes Donal nervous, which leads to them both acknowledging their admiration for each other. By S-level, Donal has fallen in love with Maribel and wants to marry her. Maribel, of course, accepts, and she makes it clear that she's able to look past their differences in station. I can definitely see a bond developing between the two of them as they work their way up to A-level, and it's easy to see them falling in love during that time. Class 3. So, which one of those eligible bachelors will have the honor of marrying Maribel? Well, if you plan on watching my Let's Play of this game, you can help answer that question. If you want Maribel to marry someone in particular, please vote for that character by posting your vote in the comments section or sending me a private message. If you feel any of the Class 0 pairings deserve a chance, You have until 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Wednesday, November 20th, to convince me to reclassify them. With that, let's move on to this week's second group rune to be. Owain. Kiel takes warfare seriously, and she finds Owain's theatrics quite annoying as her supports with him reveal. It turns out that he does like being around her, and he makes that much clear through his actions. In their B-level support conversation, Owain begs Kiel, rather childishly at that, to let him accompany her to the storehouse to get her gear. Of course, once he's with her in there, he just talks endlessly about the various suits of armor in there. I'm sorry, but there really isn't much to say here. Owain's pretty much off in his own little world, even when he's trying to be friends with Kiel. He does eventually let slip that he loves her, but I have no end of trouble believing Kiel's feelings for him. She does admit that she finds him oddly charming, but the way she talks to him doesn't give me any reason to believe she loves him. Class 0. Owain and Cynthia turn out to have a great deal in common. Both are very much into the whole dramatic hero concept, and they've been close friends since childhood, apparently having played Justice Cabal, whatever that is, together. It turns out that they don't agree on everything, though. When discussing heroic entrances, Owain says a hero should show up at the last minute and turn the tide of the battle, but Cynthia thinks a hero should be in the fray from the start, tirelessly protecting her comrades. The discussion leads to Owain getting caught up in the moment and thinking up a story of himself going mad with grief over the death of a comrade, killing friend and foe alike. In the story, Cynthia snaps him out of it, but at the cost of her own life. Real-life Cynthia is unsurprisingly bothered by this, but she doesn't hold it against him. By the S-level conversation, the topic has gotten back to the basic matter of heroic entrances. Owain has changed his mind. He wants to be in the thick of things from the start. When asked why he changed his mind, he brings up why the two of them were so into heroics in the first place, which in turn leads to them briefly reminiscing about their childhoods. Owain suggests they get together, and Cynthia agrees, but on the condition that she not die in any more of his stories. Owain accepts her terms. So, what do I think about this pairing? Well, it's clear from the start that they're already close friends. However, Owain's suggestion that he and Cynthia get together comes off as kind of offhand. Kind of odd considering his love of theatrics, and yet, maybe that's actually a sign of how sincere his feelings for her are in a way. His proposal is out of character. Admittedly, I'm probably just making excuses. I just feel Owain and Cynthia fit together perfectly. Class 3. Wait, what? Cynthia again? Well, yes, comrades, there's something I feel I should mention just in case some of you are bothered by this little detail. Awakening veterans, I'd prefer for you to remain silent as far as the details I leave out are concerned. Now then. The North American and European versions of this game do not classify Owain and Cynthia as husband and wife if they get together. Rather, they are called companions. Sounds kind of like the kind of thing a company would do with same-sex pairings to avoid pending opponents of same-sex marriage, right? Well, that's actually not too far off the mark. Owain and Cynthia happen to be cousins. The localization teams didn't bother to cut the romantic parts out of their S-level conversation, though, and it's made clear in-game that they actually are in love if they reach that point. For all intents and purposes, they are husband and wife in everything but name. Personally, I'm hoping people won't take this into account when voting, but I still felt it would have been wrong for me to conceal that information, considering that some people might be unhappy about being tricked into voting for a man to be in a relationship with his cousin. Alright, now I'm ready to move on for real. Severa is pretty much the polar opposite of Cynthia as far as Owain's theatrics are concerned. She finds his tendency to name weapons and special moves and all that childish, if not creepy. Eventually, Owain's attempt to get Severa to do the same pushes her too far, and she snaps at him. Unsurprisingly, Severa goes too far, and Owain sort of loses it. She later finds him curled up in the corner of a tent, muttering to himself. So, of course, Severa apologizes and manages to get Owain back on his feet. When the S-level conversation rolls around, Owain's back to his usual self, but he also apologizes to Severa for how he had been behaving. It turns out, however, that Severa isn't much better. she had carved Owain's name into her weapon. It turns out she had always liked him, as in, like him. Yep, another retroactive declaration of love. These seem to be quite common in the second group. Anyway, Severa drops the jerked facade and actually starts to cry over her feelings for him. Owain, of course, manages to calm her by admitting he feels the same way. It's subtle, but there are hints that Severa doesn't hate Owain as much as her attitude lets on even before S level. As for Owain, it's clear from the start that he doesn't have any problems with Severa. Their bond is an interesting one, and one I can actually believe, but I'm bothered by the sudden jump to love. Class 2. In his supports with Morgan, Owain is convinced that the two of them are fated partners and that they have been comrades in many past lifetimes. Morgan at first laughs it off as theatrics, but when Owain insists that he is telling the truth, she decides to test him. The first test is a simple culinary one. Morgan believes no past incarnation of her would ever have a partner who couldn't cook. Owain passes that test easily in the B-level conversation. Morgan then drops another test on him, saying they should swear their oath on a pair of gemstones. Yes, gemstones. When he manages to get those, Morgan acknowledges him as her partner. Then comes S level, in which Morgan reveals she was just using the tests as a way of seeing how important she was to him. And Owain reveals that the whole fated partners thing was just a ruse designed as an excuse to spend more time with her. Yep, it's another retroactive declaration of love. I would have preferred for their love to have developed over the course of the tests, rather than been there all along, but either way, it's pretty clear that they've grown close over the course of the conversations, and I can actually buy their falling in love. Class 2. Noir takes up cooking in her conversations with Owain, and turns out to be absolutely phenomenal when it comes to making sweets. When the recipe turns out to not have a name for the first confection Owain taste tests, he gives it a name. This being Owain, he gives it a very fancy name. Noir, as it turns out, loves the name, and wants him to name more recipes for her. Come S level, Noir has prepared something so amazing that Owain asks her to marry him. Turns out Noir had been planning on proposing to him after he tasted it. This results in an amusing scene when Noir's inner demon briefly breaks loose. It's funny, which is appropriate for Owain and Noir, but I'm left with the feeling that these two don't really feel anything for each other. It's just, I love your sweets, and I love the names you give them. If they talked about other things over the sweets, or if the sweets were just a lead-in to some sort of bonding, that would be one thing. But I don't see anything that qualifies as that, so I'm making this a Class 0 pairing. Owain's supports with Na largely revolve around the contrast between Owain's silliness and Na's seriousness. Owain just wants to mess around and play games with Na. Na, on the other hand, just wants to read and be left alone. It takes some time, but Na eventually manages to convince Owain to let her be. There is a bit of a reason behind Owain's behavior. He thinks it's important for the world to not be all business, which Na agrees with, but she still wants to just read. Throughout these conversations, there's the unspoken implication that Owain is thinking of Na as a child rather than an adult. It's at the end of the A-level conversation that Owain lets slip that he has, at least unconsciously, been treating Na as a child. When she criticizes him for it, he resolves to try to treat her as an adult. Come S-level, Na reveals to Owain that she loves him. Owain implies, but never really says, that he feels the same way. I don't see any bond forming between them in the earlier conversations. A mutual understanding of each other, maybe, but no bond of friendship, let alone love. Class 0. So, who will marry Owain? Excuse me. Or, in the case of Cynthia, be his companion? Well, that's up to you, comrades. If you plan on watching my LP of Fire Emblem Awakening and you want Owain to marry, or just be with, someone in particular, please vote for your preferred pairing by posting your vote in the comments section or sending me a private message with your vote. If you feel one or more of the pairings I listed as Class 0 deserve a chance, you have until 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Wednesday, November 20th, to convince me to reclassify them. For both pairing elections, the polls are closed at 12 o'clock p.m. Pacific Standard Time this Saturday, November 23rd. Here's hoping we get more than one vote this time around.